Okay, so this is complicated. This is going to be a fairly complicated topic, and I'm not going to tell anybody where I'm going with it yet. I'm really want people to focus more on the content of it and not be afraid of where it's heading. So I want to start with this. Richard Dawkins, a well-known evolutionary scientist, a naturalistic naturalism basis for everything science. So he's made a statement in the past: philosophy is dead, and that science killed it. And I don't know that he's ever retracted it. And maybe he figured it out that he should. Don't know. But I just want to use the statement because it illustrates something very important. So the authority he would have to make the statement would come from he's he's gone through the academic system and came out with a doctorate, at least to a doctorate. I don't know what doctorates all he might have, but he at least, I know he was a PhD, and I don't even know the branch of science really that he had his PhD in. I know that he debates well. He employs logic uh, a lot in his debates, and yet he makes a statement: philosophy is dead. So, a couple of problems with that. Science can't kill philosophy because science can't kill its own foundation. If something killed its own foundation, it would cease to exist. And science can't kill philosophy. So here's why. Well, and before I even get into why, Richard Dawkins, his academic career, his PhD, anything that would make him to be an esteemed person to make the statement, and you believe it, would be because he had a PhD. And his PhD is the philosophy, the philosophy. So it's the doctorate in the philosophy of whatever. So he's saying, don't listen to him. The basis for you listening to him doesn't exist. It's dead. So that's one problem with making the statement. Another problem with making the statement, though, is he's trying to use logic. He's trying to employ logic to lead to the statement. Logic is a philosophical principle, not a science principle. It's logic is used to construct and build everything scientific. It's without it, science can't exist because science is supposed to be based on observations, which you can observe without logic. So if science was solely observation, that would be okay. But that's not what science is. So you can observe, and observation really will get into other philosophical things. But you can observe, and at least not have to worry about the logic problem. But the moment you take an observation and you try to take it and propose something that might be true, right? The moment you start having a hypothesis of some sort, you have to employ logic. If I say, well, I've got a hypothesis that something works a certain way, so I've got this premise, this premise, this premise. If I prove these premises, I will have proven this conclusion, and my hypothesis will then become a theory. And that theory I can then take with whatever other theory in order to try to even prove out a law. But each step along the way, I'm employing logic. I'm employing philosophy. How is that I'm employing philosophy? How is it that logic belongs to the camp of philosophy and not to the camp of science? Well, first of all, it's kind of like the idea of observation. Observation alone is not science, right? Science takes observation and takes logic and takes actually going out and doing the testing and so on and so forth. Science takes from these different disciplines, combines them, unites them in order to achieve its own mission. So I want that to be clear to start with, that science is taking from other places in order to have, so its foundation relies on these other things. Now, why is it logic belongs to philosophy? First of all, it was born that way. So uh, anyone who employed philosophy in the past, and they were known for being good philosophers, they were establishing logical, the way this whole art of logic works. So, and the whole thing became cooler and cooler as they went. How to expose fallacy, how to show the difference between statements that have truth versus statements that don't, to establish validity, or whether something wasn't valid. Um, they they made a they made a I would almost call it a science out of doing these things. But regardless, it's philosophical principles that piece by piece by piece um, establish logic. Now, I think one reason we could maybe it can get confused with science is you can take it's hard to distinguish from good science. I mean, good science has to employ logic, but so does math, so does grammar, so does. Right? I go on and on with that. If anything that employs logic, science is certainly not alone. Science is one of many things that employ logic. All right, wisdom employs logic, and that's part of what Richard Dawkins would like to say is dead. Just because he doesn't have it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just means that he went so far into science, he got too far away from wisdom, and now he thinks that somehow it has died. It's probably died for him. That's probably why he said it. All right. So logic is a foundation of science, just as it is other things. Logic is whether you can call it an art or whatever, it doesn't really matter. But it's the mechanism for taking like a premises here, a premises here, a premises here, such as Bob likes soccer, Bill likes soccer, Leroy likes soccer. Okay, 3 premises. But somebody draws one conclusion and says, therefore, all boys like soccer. Nope, all the boys mentioned like soccer, but you can't conclude from that all boys like soccer. Somebody else could say, therefore, girls don't like soccer. What if it was this simple? Leroy likes soccer, Jim likes soccer, all boys like soccer. That third one would be a false one anyway, but let's just put it in there. Therefore, girls don't like soccer. This had nothing to do with reaching that conclusion. Now, let's do something that's a little more like sound logic. Bill likes soccer, Jim likes soccer, Bob likes soccer. I might have said one name twice, I don't know. But therefore, some boys like soccer. We got a winner, right? We have proven from that, if each of these are true, that is true. Some boys like soccer. I'm not going to get into pronoun issues or whether these names would belong to a boy or girl. I'm going with the old. I'm going with the traditional on that because case truth is very good at being distinguished from confusion. Now, if you take confusion and try to make it to where there is no truth, which is really where everything's trying to head, everything's being turned upside down in order to try to give the idea that there's really no truth, that truth is what we say it is. Problem is, most of us should know that is an attempt that is invalid itself. we know Bob, Leroy, and Jim are all boys. They always have been. But if anybody's got an issue with that, because I know everybody's got things they go through, I could have used something else. I didn't really think about that until I started doing this. I'm kind of doing some of this on a whim. I've got some notes, but some of this I'm going off on just trying to give examples. So just where I'm going. So without getting into everybody having problems with the details of this and that, um, I don't even want to come up with a different example. I don't want to exhaust myself with that one point. Hopefully, no one's offended and everybody can continue forward here. But in principally speaking, logic takes this must be true, this must be true, this must be true, and it must. If I'm going to make a conclusion from it, each of these must in whole be able to establish that conclusion. But if any of these are false, like I said a moment ago, if I said, and again, I'm going to try to stay away from anything that offends people. But if Jim likes soccer, James likes soccer, all boys like soccer, if those were the three sentences, and then we're trying to conclude something, in order to even look at the conclusion, we can't reach it until the premises are sound. So the all boys like soccer comment, it's invalid, right? It's not true. I'm not going to get into valid versus truth here. There's two parts of this in logic, but I know that all boys don't like. I mean, I could use that for the sake of an argument, but I'm going to go ahead and go another step of this and say that part's not true. So I'm only going to pay attention to whether these first two parts lead to this conclusion. In the real world, I'm going to just do that. Because I know for a fact the third one is wrong. Okay? So if I'm going to employ these tools in the real world, I automatically try to strike those things out that I know for a fact are not true. So if I'm reading an article or I'm listening to something, somebody makes a claim that I know better, and I don't mean as an opinion, I mean just as clearly as all boys like soccer. Just as clearly as that, I can strike some things that I hear. But you have to be careful because, yeah, you want to make sure it's really those types of things and not things that could be true that you just don't recognize, right? So definitely want to know the difference. You always want to know this too. What is sound? What is speculative? Okay? Sound logic is established in some way, right? It's speculative, and it's established in some way. It's valid in and of itself. Speculative might be valid. It might not. And it's something I want to keep separate. So that's part one. I didn't do a super job with it, but I think enough for where we're heading with it. I'm not really trying to teach logic here, just how it relates. So logic is the basis of testing. I can't perform a test out in the field in science without logic. If I do, it's a ridiculous test. If I just put a bunch of crazy stuff together and say that if all that's true, this will be true, then I've wasted everybody's time. But if I have employed logic and I examine, say, I think this is true. I've seen this. Wait a minute. I think this might be true. That's kind of how that works. You're not supposed to take something you think is true and then start looking around to see if things could, if you can just grab some things to make it right and then insert them. It's really got to be more like, I see some things here and I've noticed some things here, and wait a minute, this seems to be responsible for that, and that does too, and wait a minute, that does too. In fact, I don't know of anything that really creates a problem here, so I'm going to start inserting some of these as, okay, these things show that at least this is true. Now, I haven't established my whole idea, but if I can use these to establish this part, and maybe something else establish that part, then I take those bigger parts, and now I might be getting a lot closer to what I think might be true. So it's a process, right? But logic has to be used all on the way, or you get one bit of garbage in there, and it's used to form a premise for the next thing. That garbage keeps going on and on and on until now you've got an entire thing founded upon garbage. I mean, yeah, a lot of things are right, but that piece of garbage was necessary for it to work. So because of that garbage, you're wrong. And the whole thing's wrong. It collapses. Everything above the garbage collapses. This is the garbage. This is found on it. That's found on it. So now if you can take that garbage out, then you have to go back to everything that was with that garbage that built the next thing. And you got to look at every bit of it and say, hey, how was that garbage necessary to make that conclusion? That one conclusion. If it was, then crap, I got to take that out. Now, if that one was based on, right, we got a domino effect. And that I would propose, there's a lot of science, a lot of modern science that has garbage in the arguments. And it's because speculation doesn't belong in a scientific model of theory. Now, speculation it certainly belongs to hypothesis. There's nothing wrong with using a lot of statements that are right and true. And even if some of them aren't right, you're not putting them in there. They're kind of necessary to get that conclusion, so you're not putting them in there. But there's nothing wrong with that kind of that lingering idea that I've got a hypothesis, but things aren't lining up quite yet, so I can't propose it. So in the construction of a hypothesis, it's okay to battle a little bit with those premises. But you cannot get lazy on it and say, you know what, I'm pretty sure that's right. Bam, it's a hypothesis. And then bam, I take that hypothesis and some others. These, say 100 of them are valid. That one has that little crap in it, but it's necessary to form this next thing. I'm just going to throw that in there and make it work. Because I'm pretty sure you can't do it. That pretty sure stuff is what gets you. And I've got an example, but I'm just real quick. Kids are great at it. But let's say that a kid had brought his dog to the house, tumped over a lamp, and let's say it's a really nice some kind of ceramic lamp, whatever. It falls over and busts, but there's a big piece that busts off of it where he's able to glue it and kind of put it back, and just a slight little turn, no one's noticed, years go by. He's always told don't bring the dog in the house, etc. In fact, his parents, when they did find it, let's say their first statement to him was, well, I want to hear how this happened, and don't you tell me this was you, that you walked that dog through this house, and like we told you not to do, and he knocked this over. And the boy says, okay, all right, I'm not going to tell him that. And so he comes up with a creative story, and I'm not going to linger on with a bunch of story there. But just say he's got a very good, he's had years to kind of think about it. Great fabricated story. Parents buy off on it totally. In fact, I think about it more, it makes more and more sense because he fabricated it so well. Makes much more sense than the dog doing it. I mean, that was too simple. And then later, he just confesses, man, the dog did it. It blows their mind. They're like, oh, man, we were so sure. Well, a lot of science kind of works that way. Here's why. And I may have skipped a little here, and that's okay. But science is doing the same thing nowadays because it's taking, for premises, science at the outset is naturalism, right? It is based in naturalism. It precludes or excludes anything supernatural. If something is a supernatural claim, it cannot be used to establish something scientific because you got to have it be, it's got to be observable, falsifiable, et cetera, et cetera. So it's got to meet certain criteria, and it excludes, says not even going to get into supernatural things. So if you go to a speculative, if you're going into something speculative like origin, all science can do is say, is there a way to explain everything through nature if we exclude supernatural process? Is there a way to make the claim? Is there a way to make a believable claim? Because that's the other part. If it's not believable, you know, it's not going to gain much momentum anyway. So, piece by piece by piece, you come up with a great story, like the kid and the lamp that broke the lamp. But you come up with a very intricate, incredible story, and it just seems after that the whole thing takes on its own wings. As this person's that and that person, it's like, oh yeah, this is so good. Because if you try hard, you can fabricate incredible stories based on certain sets of facts. Like the story I was going to say a minute ago, I was going to say how he could say different facts, like it was extra windy that day, and there was a window, and the window was open, and so he can use things and facts and just create a scenario with those things and facts that makes it very believable. That the window was open, windy, and because it was windy, this or that happened. Somebody outside was doing this and that, and a ball came through or whatever. Doesn't matter whether the wind knocks it over, whether the ball knocks it over, or somebody's by the window because it's close to the mailbox on the door and the elbow comes through. It doesn't matter. But hey, a mailman comes. That makes sense. Window, okay. It was open, and we don't really tell them not to open the window. Da 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 da. Right. So the lamp was right by the window in case I didn't say that part of the story. So anyway, I'm just saying you can make anything believable. All right, so that's the next part. The amazing tool of logic and everything I just said brings us here pretty easily. This amazing tool of logic relies upon imagination. And boy, do we hate that that's right. If we can't stand the idea of something being supernatural, and yet imagination is required to employ logic, and logic is required to do science, then this supernatural imagination is necessary to build a science that we say excludes anything supernatural. Therefore, it says the imagination, is invalid, and therefore in science must be invalid. That's kind of the problem we get into, because we know that there are many things in science that are valid. We know that that people have used science to show that there have been hypotheses and different things that were invalid. There are even some things that they become accepted even to theory and then later disproven. And it's like, how did it make it to theory? How did we do that? A lot of people don't seem to be aware, but Haeckel's embryos were exposed as, and see that was used to show the evolution through the womb. But those were shown to be a fabrication, and those could be found in books, maybe still. In fact, I don't know if anybody uses books anymore, but that was used to establish evolution. So many different, what they were going, Piltdown Man, and I don't remember all the different hoaxes, but there were so many hoaxes that were used to establish evolution, and bit by bit they kept falling apart. They kept finding these were hoaxes, and yet every one of them were used in order to prove out evolution. Charles Darwin said early on, he comes up with all this stuff, and he says, okay, if history will bear me out, right? As we go along, see, this theory's just been proposed, so we haven't had time to prove everything, but I guarantee you, essentially, you're going to find all this in the record, in the fossil record, geological record. You're going to find as we do more archaeological digs, and you're going to find that everything I'm saying is right when you see all these transitions, when you see these transitional, but well, all the transitions between this species and that, and they're going to be all over the place. You're gonna get tired of digging and running into them because they got to be all over the place. I mean, that's the only way you get from here to here. Okay, so years go by, do all the digging, and it's not true. So, they're not finding them. Frustrated, Stephen Gould so bad that, and he's a well-known geologist, evolutionist, frustrated him so bad because he spent year after year trying to prove this out. And he got so tired of it. It was impossible. He stated it. He talked about how impossible it was. It infuriated him. So he found a solution. He had to create a solution. Punctuated equilibrium. I'm not going to get into the idea, but it helped him bypass the problem. And that's essentially these kind of bypass surgeries is what happens in order to get around all these problems. Problems we have in the geological record were mammoths are fossilized while they're still eating, animals that were fossilized while in the process of birth, digesting food, etc., etc. Okay, all these were rapid event, right? Something's eating and it becomes a fossil. The food's still there and food's still being digested in another. And like I said, in the process of giving birth, etc. Something happened so rapid that they were fossilized during the process, in that type of process. It wasn't over time, and can't be over time, right? Fossils, if something sits in the flesh, if something sits anywhere, then something's going to eat it. It's going to decay, etc., etc. But it's going to be scavenged. But what's not going to happen? There's not going to be a fossil. That fossil is a rapid event that essentially locks it up to where it's enclosed. It's closed off from things where it can't be scavenged or decay, etc. Becomes a fossil. Okay, so it's not only rapid, sudden, it's catastrophic. Sounds like a big flood, but we'll move on. So the imagination postulates sequences towards an ultimate destiny, and whether the sequences are coincidentally, if they're unrelated, linked, or precedent to a conclusion, that's something that we all have to figure out along the way. And it's important, for example, if I say my redheaded granddad is short-tempered, my redheaded girlfriend is short-tempered, therefore all redheads are short-tempered. Of course, if we find then there's a brunette, a blonde, and whatever hair colors out there, that we find samples of every one of them. Even one is sufficient. Even one is enough. But we find instead one of all of them. Then we see right off it's not prerequisite to being short-tempered. Short-tempered happens in all of these. What we could find, and so I guess what I'm going to say is the first, when we find it's in everywhere else, we'll say it's definitely not a precedent to sign. I mean, it doesn't have to a prerequisite, a precedent, prerequisite. It does not. You don't have to have redhead to be short-tempered. We find that right off. Is it linked? Is there some link between it? I'm going to suggest not, just because all these other hair colors have it too. So, but you could get into a further study, a statistical one, also based on logic, and you may find that there's some kind of link or some kind of relationship there. Or does it become totally unrelated? Do we do the findings and the stats are essentially equal across the board? We find that it's totally unrelated. So it can be any of those: unrelated, linked, so some form of link there that requires further study, And then, of course, the study wouldn't be whether the redhead was the question. It would be what causes someone to have red hair. If there was more, if that was more like 80% and the others were like 5%, we'll say, well, there's something that leads to this that we need to look at. What all things are involved, mainly with redheads, but do we also sometimes find in the others? And then we might be able to backtrack until we finally conclude, hey, this is what is present. And that's why sometimes most of the times it's redheads have this more than anybody, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so again, I probably picked on another crowd, and I apologize. Examples are cruel sometimes, I guess. I guess I should talk about people with no hair. That way I could just insult myself and, well, everybody that has that. All right, so something that should have become apparent. The logic, as etc., is founded in imagination. Got to have imagination to employ logic. Is that true? Okay, it's now getting into a funny place because you're supposed to take a foundation and build the things on the foundation. I'm trying to take something up here and backtrack and say this comes from that, and yet how do I do that, right? Because if my imagination is the foundation of my logic, then how do I go with logic to prove where it came from? Anyway, I don't know if prerequisite is important. It's easier to say science is founded on logic. I can show that. This requires a little bit of instead of deduction, a little bit of induction. Induction. Don't anyway. Okay. So I'm not going to get lost in this. I might have picked the wrong word. I just don't. I just got to keep going. So first comes the imagination and logic. Okay. So narratives. Okay, narratives. Okay, so when we start to have narratives where we take observations and we bring them towards conclusions because they fit narratives, we start to see some of the problem of taking logic and not of letting essentially not employing logic correctly. When the world of truth, which is way out here, and so I'm taking this out of the screen on purpose because it's beyond, it becomes restricted, and hopefully it's about the size of the screen here. So anyway, this little area becomes my boundary, and that becomes everything that is true to me. If I live in that world, then narratives that help build that framework, then I allow the things that fit inside, I allow those things to be real. If something jumps outside, I catch it before it jumps out, and I say, right here, this is true. This makes sense. But you just went out there. Yep. Well, that's out there. So when we say that's just out there, that's out of our view, which means it might be false, but it might be true. It might be just out of our framework. But this is the narrative world that I might be boxed in to, which we also would call the world view that I have. And they're a little different in what they are, but I'm not going to get into that. So